Dark side of the church revealed. Ancient documents point to hidden ceremonies kept in secret, away from the public eye. What else are they hiding? Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share it with your friends, so everyone can discover what lies behind the closed doors of the Vatican. My name is Alessandro Conti, and I never imagined that my years of faithful service to the Catholic Church would lead me to question everything I believed in. I am a historian and archivist, specializing in the history of the popes and the documents locked away in the Vatican's secret archives. Since becoming a member of the archives team, I gained access to ancient texts, manuscripts, and accounts that few in the world have seen. However, I always felt there was much more hidden, and that some secrets even the most experienced archivists could not touch. The Vatican is a fortress of secrets. In the silent corridors, every priest and every employee seems to hold a story they will never share. After years of work, I eventually gained rare access to the so-called Archive Sotto, a restricted section within the secret archive itself. This place is a legend among us. It is said to hold documents that reveal dark details about the Church's past, prohibited treaties, documents about ancient rituals, and even letters from exorcists containing accounts of possessions that defy any explanation. I was prepared for my first visit to the Archive Sotto. That day, my co-workers avoided looking me in the eyes, as if they knew I was about to discover something that would change my life forever. When I finally entered, I felt a strange weight in the air. It was as if the environment was filled with an ancient, dense energy, something that could not be easily explained. As I approached the old shelves, my fingers touched dusty, hard-covered books, some written in Latin and others in languages I did not immediately recognize. I felt like I was stepping into forbidden territory. The first thing I found was a volume titled Codex Serpentis. The title caught my attention immediately. I opened it carefully, feeling the stiff leather of the old cover and observing the letters worn by time. The content spoke of a hidden order within the Vatican, a secret fraternity that had supposedly formed centuries ago, dedicated to preserving the truth about the sacred and the profane. As I turned the pages, one name appeared repeatedly: Fraternitas Serpentinus, or the Brotherhood of the Serpent. Apparently, this fraternity believed that the true power of the Vatican came from unknown forces, forces that went beyond human comprehension and supposedly resided at the very heart of the Church. With each page, a shiver ran down my spine. It felt like I was being watched somehow. In the deep silence, I could hear only my breathing and the sound of yellowed pages being turned. The book contained bizarre illustrations, half human, half serpent figures that seemed to dance around an inverted cross. I began to feel an almost physical discomfort, a sensation of both repulsion and attraction. Was I truly discovering a secret so deep that even the highest ranks of the Vatican did not want to admit it? That was when I heard footsteps approaching. I quickly closed the book and looked around. One of the bishops, Dom Lorenzo, A tall man with an austere appearance entered the room. He stared at me for a few seconds before speaking. "Mr. Conti, there are books in this archive that carry heavy knowledge. Knowledge that sometimes turns out dangerous for those who dare to challenge it." He gave me a slight smile, but his eyes expressed no humor at all. I knew it was a warning, a polite way of telling me I was treading forbidden ground. His presence made me uncomfortable, but I could not back away. Something inside me told me that if I left it alone, I would never have another chance. Dom Lorenzo left, and the silence returned to dominate the room. Reluctantly, I reopened Codex Serpentis and continued reading. The book suggested that the members of Fraternitas Serpentinus kept hidden symbols in the Vatican's rooms, symbols that could only be seen under certain conditions, like a specific angle or exact lighting. One of these symbols was in the Paul VI audience hall. The next day, I gathered my courage and went to the audience hall, determined to confirm the presence of these symbols. When I arrived, I waited until the place was empty to observe every detail. I positioned myself in a corner and looked at the altar at the back. Over time, I noticed what had once seemed impossible. There, staring at the altar from a certain angle, it was as if I was looking at the face of a serpent. The cold, penetrating eyes and the mouth that seemed slightly open, ready to swallow everything before it. My heart raced. It could not have been a coincidence. I was seeing confirmation of something the Church clearly did not want anyone to know. From that day on, my routine was never the same. The feeling that I was being watched intensified. As I walked through the corridors, I had the impression of hearing low murmurs, voices that fell silent as I approached. Dom Lorenzo seemed to observe me from afar, always present in places where I had never seen him before. It was as if he was testing me, waiting to see how far I would go. The following days were a mixture of anxiety and fear. Each night, I slept less and less, haunted by the image of the serpent and the weight of the words in that book. I knew that if I continued investigating, I might find something even more disturbing. After reading about Fraternitas Serpentinus and its secret symbols, I became obsessed with the idea of investigating the Paul VI audience hall. This specific place was mentioned in Codex Serpentis as the central point of many enigmatic symbols linked to this secret order. I needed to see it with my own eyes. One morning, I took advantage of the start of the day when there was less movement to visit the hall alone. My position as an archivist allowed me this kind of mobility, and with a bit of luck, I could go unnoticed. As I approached the audience hall, a strange weight began to form in the air around me, as if the structure itself was warning me to stay away. My heart beat faster, but I continued, determined to see up close what was so special or dark about that place. As soon as I entered, silence enveloped me like a heavy cloak. The high walls and curved ceiling felt almost oppressive, forming an environment of darkness and almost absolute silence. The light was scarce, filtered through small windows that made the place dim, creating shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. I observed the space carefully, trying to understand what made the room seem so threatening. After a few minutes, positioned at a specific angle, I noticed something strange. From where I stood, looking at the altar in the back, the contours of the room formed a disturbing image. The structure shaped itself into an animalistic face, with what looked like two vacant, lifeless eyes staring at me. Worse yet, the altar formed a slightly open mouth, as if it was part of a lurking serpent ready to strike. My entire body shuddered. It could not be a coincidence. It was evident that the design of the room was not just an artistic choice. It was a message, a symbol hidden in plain sight. I felt the urge to back away, but I was too fascinated to leave. The design seemed intentional, and what I saw suggested that something terrible inhabited that space. I wondered who could have approved such a project in the heart of the Vatican. The symbolism was too strong to ignore. While trying to process what I had just seen, I heard footsteps behind me. I felt the blood freeze. I was so absorbed that I had not noticed someone else had entered. I turned slowly and saw the young Father Marco. He was an assistant to one of the bishops, and although we knew each other by sight, we had never exchanged many words. He looked at me with a curious, almost mischievous smile. "Alessandro, what brings you here so early in the audience hall?" he asked in a casual tone, but with a certain firmness in his words. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "Just archivist curiosity," I replied, smiling slightly. "I like to study the architectural details." Father Marco smiled, but his eyes seemed to evaluate every word I said. "You know, they say this room has its own energy. Some prefer not to come here alone," he said, still watching me. There was something unsettling in his tone. For a moment, I thought of sharing what I had seen, but something inside me stopped me. His look made me uncomfortable, as if he already knew what I had discovered and was enjoying my discomfort. He continued, "If I were you, I'd be careful with what you try to understand. There are symbols that were not meant to be revealed to just anyone." His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I was certain he knew much more about that room than he was letting on. With that warning, Father Marco left, and the weight of silence once again took over the room. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as I watched him leave. He knew something. Perhaps he was a member of the Fraternitas Serpentinus, or at least knew enough to understand what I was investigating. And he had given me an indirect answer, a warning, to back off. When he finally disappeared down the corridor, I turned back to the altar. The image of the serpent was still there, almost mocking my fear. The more I tried to push the idea away, the more it stuck, as if the place really had a force of its own. It was a confirmation of everything I suspected. The audience hall was not just an auditorium. It was a symbol, a sacred place that held a dark secret, hidden in plain sight. When I left that place, I knew I was being watched. The looks I received from other priests and Vatican staff seemed to know what I had seen. In the days that followed, the silence around me became almost suffocating. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and even in the busiest corridors, I felt my steps being followed. I tried to focus on other tasks, but my mind always returned to that vision in the audience hall, that serpent that seemed as alive as my fear. I had already heard of the famous sculpture La Resurrezione by Pericle Fazzini, which stood in the center of the Paul VI Hall. The work was commissioned by the Vatican itself and supposedly depicted Christ rising from a nuclear explosion, symbolizing victory over death. But what I saw now was something different, very different. When I entered the room and stood before the sculpture for the first time, I felt a sense of discomfort. The figure was colossal, almost disproportionate to the surrounding space. In the middle of that chaotic tangle of forms, Christ appeared distorted, with an anguished, almost unrecognizable face. Something in it did not convey peace, but rather despair. It seemed as if he was being dragged into an endless nightmare. The expression was one of fear and pain, as if condemned to an eternity of suffering. Nothing in that face evoked the idea of hope or redemption. I approached cautiously, trying to understand why this sculpture, which theoretically represented resurrection, seemed to bring an oppressive feeling. The face of Christ, stretched and contorted, gave the impression that he was screaming in silence. The eyes, fixed on something I could not see, reflected an anguish that seemed to come from beyond human understanding. Almost instinctively, I stepped back, but continued observing every detail of the work. The sculpture seemed to stare back at me, as if it had a life of its own. I tried to push the idea away, but something in that figure seemed to pulse, a presence that was both fascinating and terrifying. It was impossible not to wonder, what exactly did the Church mean by placing this image in the heart of the Vatican? What does this sculpture truly represent? The more I looked, the more disturbing details I noticed. Around Christ, the abstract bronze forms seemed to writhe, as if they were bodies in agony. Arms and legs emerged from the chaos, trying to escape, or perhaps trying to drag Christ himself into that hell. I knew the work was meant to symbolize triumph over death, but at that moment, it seemed more like a representation of failure, of damnation. In the absolute silence of the room, I felt I was being watched. I turned, somewhat embarrassed by feeling so exposed, but there was no one there. I turned back to the sculpture, and then I noticed something strange in Christ's gaze. It seemed as if the work wanted to tell me something, to reveal a secret that went far beyond simple religious interpretation. A dark thought formed in my mind. What if this sculpture was actually a reflection of the Church's hidden side? A symbol of what really went on within its walls? As I tried to push those thoughts away, I heard footsteps echoing through the room. They were slow, deliberate, and seemed to come closer and closer. I looked back and saw Dom Lorenzo, the same bishop who had warned me about the secret archives, standing a few meters from me. He watched me with a serious, almost paternal look. "Impressive, isn't it?" he said, without taking his eyes off the sculpture. I nodded, not knowing what to say. Dom Lorenzo continued, "This sculpture, is controversial to many, even within the church. Some believe it represents something that should be kept hidden. I knew he was trying to tell me something, but the fear of asking directly stopped me. He approached, looking intently at Christ's distorted face. "You see, Alessandro, resurrection to some is more than just a symbol of hope. It can also be a transformation, and not always a pure transformation." He paused, and I felt that those words carried a weight far beyond a simple conversation. He then turned to me. "There are aspects of the sacred that are not shown to the public, parts of our faith that are kept in the shadows. Perhaps because some are not prepared to understand." His eyes shone strangely, as if he wanted me to understand something beyond what he could openly explain. Dom Lorenzo walked away, and I was left there alone, staring at the sculpture with an even greater sense of unease. The figure of Christ, with that empty gaze and expression of terror, seemed to represent more than a simple, artistic interpretation. I kept thinking about Dom Lorenzo's words, wondering what he meant by parts kept in the shadows. It was as if he wanted to warn me, as if the sculpture was a warning. A part of me wanted to walk away and forget everything, but another, even stronger part knew I needed to understand. After everything I saw in the audience hall and the sculpture La Resurrezione, the idea that the Vatican hid something much greater than historical secrets seemed increasingly real. It wasn't just about old doctrines or forbidden interpretations of the Bible. No, what I felt was something more sinister, a secret that perhaps touched something beyond our world. And then, in one of my researches, I came across its name. Lucifer. Yes, the Vatican has a telescope called Lucifer, located on Mount Graham in the United States. This telescope is, in fact, an abbreviation, but the name didn't seem like a coincidence. Lucifer, the light bearer, one of the most controversial titles and absolutely forbidden for the church. Why would they use that name? Was it a mistake in choice, an irony, or was there something darker behind this decision? The idea that the Vatican maintained such powerful equipment with such a name made me uneasy, but a part of me could not resist. I had to find out what they were looking for with that telescope. Did the Vatican know something about heaven and hell that the rest of us couldn't even imagine? Could it be that they were searching for something that defies faith itself? I managed with some difficulty to gain access to documents about Lucifer in the archives that only a few staff members could consult. I took the elevator to an underground section, an area where the archives seemed almost forgotten, old and dusty. When I opened the first folder, a chill ran down my spine. The first document contained unusual celestial charts and maps indicating regions of deep space, areas that were said to contain only emptiness. Among the technical notes, a few words jumped out at me. Search for entity, Cipher 0, and hidden cosmos. I barely understood what Cipher 0 meant, but the term appeared in several notes. Some reports seemed to be from observers and scientists connected to the project, describing anomalous light phenomena that had been observed in regions of space where nothing should have been. Whatever it was, they weren't looking for stars or planets. No, it seemed like something much bigger, but what could it be? A presence? An ancient intelligence? A force they couldn't explain? I kept reading, but most of the documents were observation records, written in technical language and with symbols I didn't recognize. Even so, one specific note, scribbled in the margin, seemed to call my attention. We are not the first to look into the void. Others tried, and upon seeing, were blinded. What if we go too far? Amid these reports, a name appeared, Father Angelo. He was one of the few people at the Vatican coordinating research with the telescope. I only knew him by sight, but I knew he was a reserved man with a stern look. I decided to find him, but I had to wait a few days to arrange a private meeting. During the meeting, Father Angelo didn't seem at all surprised by my curiosity. On the contrary, his gaze suggested he already knew something. When I mentioned the telescope, he merely nodded and said in an almost monotonous tone, "Alessandro, do you know what it means to look into the void and try to understand what is beyond our reach? We call it lurks because it is the light bearer, the light that illuminates what should not be seen." It sounded like a warning, but I couldn't contain myself. I asked what exactly they were looking for. He was silent for a few moments, and then replied, almost in a whisper, "The truth is, we are not seeking scientific knowledge. We are looking for answers that challenge faith, things for which even the Vatican has no explanation. There are forces beyond heaven and hell, Alessandro, and perhaps some of them are watching us in return." Those words sent an intense chill through me. Forces beyond heaven and hell? Then why would the church risk peering into these forces? I insisted, asking if they had found any evidence, but he merely stood up and indicated the meeting was over. His previously dry and calculated gaze now seemed to reflect an ancient fear, almost as if he had already seen whatever it was that the Vatican was seeking. When I left, my head was full of questions. What was Cipher Zero? Were they really searching for an entity, a form of life, a consciousness, or something worse? Something so ancient and powerful that it defied the very definition of God and the devil. I couldn't sleep that night. My thoughts wandered to distant places, imagining what might exist in the depths of space, waiting silently. In my dreams, I saw something, a shadow moving slowly across the sky, a presence that brought with it an almost tangible darkness. At one point in the dream, it looked directly at me, and its gaze was like a black hole, an abyss that seemed to suck out any remnants of hope or peace I might feel. In the following days, Father Angelo avoided any conversation with me, and I began to notice strange looks from my colleagues. I felt they knew I had touched something forbidden, something they preferred to keep in the shadows. Even so, my obsession only grew. I needed to know, how far was the Vatican willing to go to understand these forces? Everything I had discovered so far, the architectural secrets, the sculpture of La Resurrezione, the LUCIFR telescope, and the mysterious Cipher Zero, seemed to lead to an even deeper and darker point, as if it were only the surface of a still greater secret. That's when I began to notice the presence of a specific symbol in some of the oldest manuscripts I found, the Baphomet. The figure was strange and immediately caused me repulsion, but I couldn't look away. It represented a mythical figure, half man, half goat, with horns and a fixed, cold, challenging gaze. The idea that this symbol was associated with the Vatican seemed absurd at first, and the more I read, the more absurd and disturbing the revelations became. In the archives, I found documents mentioning a secret order called Fraternitas Serpentinus, or Brotherhood of the Serpent, which supposedly operated since the early days of the Church. This fraternity believed that the true power of the Vatican did not come solely from faith or preaching, but from hidden knowledge, something that transcended human understanding. According to the records, the symbol of Baphomet was the representation of this supreme knowledge, and at the same time, the guardian of hidden truth. Upon reading this phrase, I felt a chill. Guardian? Guardian of what? As I turned the pages, I found references to something called Cipher Zero. Apparently, the fraternity believed that this symbol and Cipher Zero were connected, but it did not explain how. The text was vague, as if the authors themselves feared writing too much. There was a passage, however, that caught my attention. He who seeks Baphomet finds the bearer of light and darkness, the guardian between two worlds. In the footer, someone had written by hand, "To open the door, the price must be paid." What did this door mean? What kind of knowledge required a price? And what kind of entity or secret so profound could justify the presence of the Baphomet symbol at the heart of the Vatican? I began to realize that this fraternity was not just a legend. It seemed that this sect truly believed the Vatican had a connection with forces beyond our understanding. That was when my path crossed with Dom Lorenzo once again. I was leafing through one of the old books when he appeared at the entrance, his imposing silhouette highlighted against the dim light of the corridor. He stood silently for a few seconds, watching me, and then motioned for me to follow him. We climbed together a narrow staircase leading to an isolated room, hidden among little-used corridors. When we arrived, he looked at me with an expression that mixed coldness and compassion. "Alessandro, I've heard that you've been asking questions about things you shouldn't know." I hesitated but didn't deny it. I asked him directly about Baphomet and Cipher Zero. He sighed, closing his eyes briefly as if gathering strength. Then he began to speak in a low, calm voice, almost as if reciting a sacred text. "The symbol of Baphomet is ancient, Alessandro, older than you can imagine. It represents the duality of the universe, good and evil, light and darkness, spirit and flesh. It is the symbol of those who understand the balance between the sacred and the profane. In the Vatican, it is a forbidden symbol, but also essential. My heart was racing. I tried to focus, knowing he was about to reveal something fundamental. Dom Lorenzo continued, "Cipher Zero is a reference to an entity beyond our comprehension, a force, something that transcends the concept of God and the devil, a presence that exists in the depths of space. Baphomet is our key to accessing it." The room seemed to darken as he spoke, and each word felt like a blade cutting through my understanding of reality. I tried to absorb it all, but it was impossible. What was he telling me? That the Vatican, the Church itself, maintained a connection with something beyond our world, something ancient, powerful, and perhaps malevolent. I knew I shouldn't ask more, but the words escaped my mouth. Why? Why does the Church maintain a connection with something like this? He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mix of pity and terror. Because this force, this Cipher Zero, gave us something. It showed us truths that the world would never understand. The Church seeks balance between faith and forbidden knowledge, but there is a price to pay. There always has been. Dom Lorenzo stepped closer, his face pale. We have to feed it. Keep the Guardian satisfied, so to speak, so we can continue our work in peace. He paused and sighed deeply. Some of those who disappeared, well, they are part of that sacrifice. We need to give something in return to maintain the balance. It was too much to process. Was he talking about human sacrifices, disappeared people given to an incomprehensible force? I felt a wave of nausea, but forced myself to stay firm. I asked him if all of this was true. He just looked at me and smiled darkly. Do you think these secrets would survive for so long if they were a lie, Alessandro? Those words echoed in my mind, as if someone had struck my chest with a truth I could not bear. All my upbringing, my faith, and my beliefs were being destroyed. I had crossed a line that I could never undo. The Church I had served and trusted my life to was connected to a hidden entity, a power that used the very symbol of Baphomet as a gateway. That night, I returned to my room in the Vatican but couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Baphomet appeared, with a fixed, empty, merciless gaze, as if it was waiting. I had a dream, but it felt real. In the dream, I was in a dark room, surrounded by hooded figures, chanting in a language I could not understand. In the center of the day room, there was a large statue of Baphomet. They came closer, and I felt something coming, something I could not avoid. When I woke up, my heart was racing, and my clothes were drenched in sweat. In the dim light of the room, I swore I saw a shadow at the foot of my bed, a presence watching me. I knew at that moment that I was no longer alone. The Guardian was with me. From that day on, I began to see shadows everywhere, feeling that I was being followed. My nights were haunted by nightmares, and my spirit tormented by a sense of guilt and horror. I had learned too much, and the Church, well, it wouldn't let me leave without paying the price. After that last conversation with Dom Lorenzo, I realized that something dark and relentless was unfolding around me. I tried to convince myself that they were just fragments of curiosity that had gone too far. But deep down, I knew I had been marked. The Vatican was not just a fortress of faith. It was a place where ancient secrets merged with the incomprehensible, and now I was at the center of it all, entangled in a darkness that until then I believed existed only in legends and myths. After that night, I began to feel changes around me and, strangely, within me. I saw shadows on the walls, movements in the corners of my room, and heard whispers that seemed to call my name. I tried to convince myself that it was all the result of exhaustion, sleepless nights, and the weight of recent revelations. But even in silence, I felt the presence of something ancient, something that watched me closely. That night, something inside me broke. I felt I was no longer myself. It was as if the Guardian had left a mark within me, something that grew and consumed my essence. I spent the following days in a daze, almost like a ghost, wandering the corridors of the Vatican, but feeling that I no longer belonged there or anywhere else. Then, one night, I went to my room and realized I was no longer alone. The presence that had once observed me from afar was now closer than ever. The shadows in the corner of the room took shape, and among them I once again saw Baphomet's eyes, fixed and relentless. He was there, waiting, and I knew the moment had come. I closed my eyes, accepting the fate I had sealed for myself. The truth I had sought for so long had finally caught up with me, and the Guardian was ready to claim his price. I felt an immense cold, a void that began to take hold of me, sucking everything I was, my memories, my thoughts, my soul. It all seemed to dissipate, absorbed by that inhuman presence. And then at the last moment before being consumed, a phrase echoed in my mind like a final warning. The truth demands sacrifices. When I woke, I was alone on the floor of the room, enveloped in absolute silence. The figure had disappeared, but I knew that something inside me had changed. I looked at my hands, trembling and pale, and realized I was no longer the same. The Guardian had left his mark, a shadow I would carry forever. Today, so many years later, I am finally here to reveal to you what I could never tell anyone. The truth is that what I found in the depths of the Vatican was not just a forgotten secret. It was something alive, pulsing, lurking. And now I understand that by approaching the Guardian, by touching forbidden mysteries, I crossed a line from which I could never return. Sometimes I still feel that presence, whispering in the shadows, as if watching every thought, waiting for the right moment to claim the final prize. I wonder if I had turned back, if I had never entered that last corridor, would I be free? Or was the fate sealed from the beginning? Well, we have reached the end of our journey today. I thank each of you who has been with me until now. If you like this story and want to hear more hidden and inexplicable secrets, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to bring dark revelations and suspense-filled stories. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the upcoming videos. Leave a comment below, letting me know what you thought of this terrifying journey, and share it with friends who, like you, are drawn to the darkest mysteries. See you in the next one. And remember, there are secrets that watch those who seek them.